In January 1979, the Iranian Revolution forced the reigning Shah to flee into exile abroad. In February 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini, the spiritual leader behind the revolution, returned from exile abroad. Then in two referendums held in 1979, Iranians voted to abolish the monarchy and form an Islamic republic with Ayatollah Khomeini as supreme leader. By February 1980, Iran had fully transitioned to an Islamic theocracy. These developments were closely watched in Iraq, Iran's neighbor to the west, and particularly by Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi dictator. And with Iran's adopting a hardline theocracy, relations between Iran and Iraq deteriorated as Iran's Islamic fundamentalism contrasted sharply with Iraq's secular, Arab nationalist agenda. Relations further worsened when Khomeini derided Iraq's secularism as un-Islamic that must be overthrown and turned into an Islamic state in line with his aim of spreading Islamic revolutions across the Middle East. Iran and Iraq also shared a disputed border along the Shat el-Arab, the 200-kilometer-long river between southern Iraq and western Iran, a long source of animosity that had spurred both countries to launch a weapons buildup in the 1960s to 1970s. Iran-Iraq tensions also stemmed from the Sunni-Shiite divide. Both countries had Muslim majorities comprising 95% of their populations. However, in Iran, Shiites made up 90% of all Muslims and held political power, while in Iraq, Shiites comprised 66% of all Muslims, but the minority Sunnis, led by Saddam, held absolute power. Ethnic differences may have also factored into the war. In Iraq, Arabs comprised some 70% of the population, while in Iran, Persians constitute perhaps 65%. By the start of the war, both sides had considerable military power. Saddam also wanted to make Iraq the dominant power in the Middle East and was confident of achieving a quick victory over Iran, particularly since Iran was experiencing great social turmoil immediately after the Iranian Revolution. In the summer of 1980, border clashes, artillery duels, and air attacks began breaking out. Full-scale war broke out on September 22, 1980, when Iraqi forces launched a full invasion, with ground forces advancing in the north, central, and south. In the south, which was the main invasion sector, Iraqi forces advanced 80 kilometers into oil-rich Khuzestan and gained control of 50% of the province. But by December 1980, the Iraqi invasion had sputtered because of logistical problems, overstretched positions, and increasing Iranian resistance. Saddam then ordered his forces to halt and switch to defensive positions. Meanwhile in Iran, the invasion spurred Iranians into nationalistic and religious fervor, and hundreds of thousands of civilians rushed to join the military. In early 1981, Iran launched its first counteroffensive and began to take the initiative in the war, which it would hold until 1987. During the war, Iran would launch no less than 70 offensives, mostly inside Iraqi territory. While doing battle with regular machineries such as tanks and planes, Iranian forces also included civilian volunteers who launched repeated so-called human wave attacks across no man's land onto entrenched Iraqi positions. The frontal attacks and extensive trenches, as well as the use of chemical weapons and gas masks later in the war, and long periods of stalemated positions drew similarities to the fighting in World War I. In 1981, Iranian forces launched offensives to recapture Khuzestan, lifting the siege on Abadan and retaking Bostan. Further Iranian operations in 1982 recaptured more territory, with Iranian air firepower particularly devastating on Iraqi armored units. The high point came in May 1982 when Iranian forces recaptured Khorramshahr. Iranian forces then launched major offensives in the Kurd-dominated northern Iraq and Shiite-dominated southern Iraq, with the aim of inciting the two groups to rise up in revolt against Saddam's government. In July 1983, Iranian forces opened their offensive in northern Iraq. Supported by Kurdish rebels, by September 1983, the Iranians had pushed back Iraqi forces and threatened strategically important Sulaymaniyah and the vital Kirkuk oil facility. Further offensives in 1986 and 1987 made some progress but failed to capture Sulaymaniyah and Kirkuk. The Iranian initiative would persist until March 1988 with attacks that caused disruptions to the Kirkuk oil refinery and Darbandikhan Dam power plant. The northern front would remain fluid for most of the war. The primary aim of the whole Iranian offensive was the capture of Basra, Iraq's second largest city and center of the Iraqi oil industry. In July 1982, Iranian forces launched an offensive on Basra, with some 100,000 troops advancing in repeated human wave assaults, but were beaten back by Iraqi artillery, armored and air firepower. Further offensives using human wave tactics in 1984 and 1985 were also repelled with high casualties. Although geographically closer to Baghdad, the central sector experienced much less fighting than in the other fronts. Here, Iran's objectives were to expel Iraqi forces from captured territory, exert pressure on Baghdad, and threaten to cut off southern Iraq. However, repeated Iranian offensives into Iraq were repulsed. Iran and Iraq are major oil producers, and 20% of the world's oil passes through the Persian Gulf. In 1984, the Persian Gulf emerged as a new front in the so-called tanker war. Iraqi planes attacked oil tankers and other commercial vessels entering Iranian ports. The Iranian Navy, which controlled the Gulf, retaliated by attacking third-party vessels that it believed were carrying Iraqi oil and goods. Over 500 ships were damaged by attacks in the tanker war. Also in 1984, the so-called War of the Cities broke out when Iraq launched air and rocket attacks on Iranian towns and cities, particularly using Soviet Scud missiles on Iranian cities. Iran retaliated also with Scud missiles on Baghdad, Kirkuk, and Basra, resulting in Scud jewels. As a result, hundreds of thousands of Iranian civilians fled to the countryside, and Scud attacks caused thousands of civilian deaths on both sides. In January 1987, Iran launched its long-anticipated final offensive on Basra, which ultimately became the largest and bloodiest battle of the war. Some 1 million troops on both sides took part in the 7-week battle, resulting in some 85,000 combined fatalities. Repeated Iranian human wave assaults breached 4 of the 5 heavily fortified Iraqi positions, but which ultimately failed to take the city. This failure had a powerful demoralizing effect on Iran. The general population became war-weary and felt that the war was unwinnable. Furthermore, Iran's control of the Persian Gulf was challenged when in July 1987, U.S. Navy ships began providing escort protection for Kuwaiti oil tankers passing through the Gulf. Confrontation was inevitable, and in April 1988, the U.S. Navy, in retaliation for a frigate that nearly sunk after hitting an Iranian mine, attacked the Iranian Navy, sinking and destroying several vessels. However, the U.S. presence was tarnished when in July 1988, a U.S. cruiser missile accidentally shot down an Iranian civilian airliner, killing everyone on board. This and Iran's loss of domination of the Persian Gulf would be factors in its decision to end the war. Then in spring 1988, after another weapons buildup, Iraqi forces went on the offensive. In April 1988, Al-Fo was retaken, as was Majnun Island in June 1988. However, an Iraqi offensive to recapture Khuzestan was repelled by fierce Iranian resistance. In the central sector, Iraqi forces captured Mehran and Del Oran. In the north, Iranian forces withdrew across the border into Iran, and Iraqi warplanes launched attacks on the Kurds. After the war had ended, Iraqi forces launched a powerful campaign that inflicted thousands of Iraqi Kurdish casualties and depopulated and destroyed villages that by September 1988 had put an end to the Kurdish rebellion. By July 1988, the Iranian army was a spent force, its fighting spirit and morale at a critical low, and its front lines on the verge of breaking down. Even so, the war appeared drawn out, stalemated, and unending. Since early in the war, the United Nations made attempts to end the fighting, which both sides, particularly Iran, rejected. Then on July 20, 1988, a Security Council resolution called for a ceasefire and for both sides to withdraw their forces to international borders, which Iran and Iraq accepted, thus marking the end of the war. Thereafter, UN peacekeepers arrived to enforce the ceasefire. The war cost some 1 to 2 million total casualties, with 500,000 fatalities. Both Iraq and Iran declared victory despite the war ending in a stalemate and both failing to achieve their main objective in the war, Iraq unable to annex oil-rich Kurdistan and Iran failing to overthrow Saddam and turning Iraq into an Islamic state. By war's end, both countries were verging on financial collapse, with their economies devastated as a large portion of their oil-producing infrastructures, the mainstay of their economies, had been destroyed. Throughout the war, both sides had targeted the other's economic infrastructures, in particular oil refineries and depots, as well as oil transport facilities. Then in August 1990, mainly because of economic difficulties resulting from the war, Iraq invaded and annexed Kuwait. This in turn led to the Gulf War in January 1991, a US-led coalition campaign that expelled Iraqi forces from Kuwait.